Hello, everyone. My name is Peter Fishkind. I am an adjunct with the MirYam Institute. My former experience is working with the MirYam Institute as a law student at the University of Pennsylvania. I also attended the MirYam Institute's delegation to Israel and am a proud contributor as an adjunct. Currently, I live in Great Neck, New York. I'm running for a local political office on Long Island, and my background is as an attorney at a corporate law firm in New York. Today, I'm very pleased to be here with Yaakov Lappin. Yaakov is an Israeli-based military affairs correspondent and analyst. He provides insight and analysis for a number of media outlets, including jns.org and many others. He's also worked as a defense correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, a research associate for the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar-Ilan University, and is a guest contributor on a number of different international news television networks. He's also the author of The Virtual Caliphate, and he holds a BA in Politics and Modern History from the University of Manchester and an MA in History of International Relations from the London School of Economics. Today, we're going to discuss a number of issues focusing on some of the recent events in the Middle East and a particular focus on Iran's role in the region. So Yaakov, with that, I'll turn it over to you. Obviously there's now an announced ceasefire as we discussed this on this Monday, May 24th, I should note. But we saw in the last few weeks over 4,000 rockets shot by Hamas towards Israel. I leave it to you to give a brief overview of what's happened the last few weeks and what we've learned from it.
So we are currently in a ceasefire situation, which appears to be holding. And looking back over the past few weeks, I would make a number of observations. First of all, it appears as if a number of factors led Hamas to decide to launch this wave of aggression against the state of Israel and fire on its capital city, which just on its symbolic terms is obviously a very aggressive thing to do to a state, to fire on its capital. And that symbolism was not lost on the Israeli defense establishment when it decided to respond in the way that it responded. What happened was that Hamas's confidence became very high, both because it identified weakness within Israel because of ongoing political instability here. It recognized an opportunity to overtake Fatah and claim this crown, this mantle of being the representative of the Palestinian people, the guardian of Jerusalem. And also Hamas's force buildup had been going strong in recent years. It was able to amass approximately 15,000 rockets of various ranges. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the second largest faction in Gaza, had 10,000 rockets. And even though there was an assessment that Hamas was interested in a long-term arrangement, these factors came together, as well as tensions in Jerusalem at that time, that Hamas saw an opportunity to initiate an assault on Israel, and making the calculation that it would walk away from this confrontation with a net gain, even though it was taking some considerable risks.
So in your assessment and in the assessment you understand from various experts in the field, do you think that Israel was prepared for this?
So the Israeli defense establishment was fully aware of Hamas's rocket arsenal, their ranges, their warheads. All of this information was known. Also, Hamas's attempt to create quote unquote surprises, which we saw multiple attempts to do during this confrontation, including UAV attacks, cross-border tunnel attacks, a guided torpedo attempt to attack an offshore Israeli gas rig. All of these things were known by the defense establishment, anti-tank missile fire on civilians and military targets near the Gaza border. What was not known was the intention to use them, when specifically Hamas was planning on using them. So if we make a differentiation, when you assess things in the intelligence world, you usually divide it up into a capability and intention. So the capability was known. The intention of when to activate those capabilities was not known because up until a day before the escalation, the general assessment in Israel had been that Hamas was interested in maintaining the current calm and seeking a greater arrangement for Gaza that would allow its economy to do better than the state of borderline collapse that it was in. So those are two separate assessments, and again, I would say in terms of capabilities, there were not many surprises, but there was a surprise, in my opinion, in terms of Hamas's decision on when to open fire.
That is very interesting indeed. So as the conflict carried on over the last couple of weeks, as is often the case, Israel's goal is to successfully degrade Hamas's capabilities or otherwise disincentivize them in a next round to take a step and attack Israel. What's your assessment of what the IDF was able to do to Hamas capacities in Gaza as the ceasefire was now reached?
Well, the IDF severely degraded Hamas's capabilities in the Gaza Strip. It destroyed a large section of its underground tunnel, which it dubbed the Metro network. And it destroyed about 100 kilometers of this. And when we take into account the fact that it cost $500,000 per kilometer to dig, that gives you an indication of how much money Hamas invested in this at the expense of the welfare of the Gazan people. This is cement that was going into Gaza for building civilian things, and it goes underground. It all goes underground. So that attack by Israel on Hamas's underground system was a severe blow, not only in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of morale, because it really took away Hamas's ability to move underground out of the sights of the Israeli Air Force, and it was using these tunnels to move operatives, rockets, anti-tank missile cells, and all sorts of capabilities that Hamas needs to fight to attack Israeli cities with rockets and to challenge a potential Israeli ground invasion if that were to happen. So these tunnels had very important roles, and the fact that Israel was able to map them out and figure out ways of destroying them, primarily by striking them with a munition and then hitting that same spot again with another munition and drilling down in very strategic places that block up the network, and killed dozens of special force Hamas members in the process. So this was certainly a major achievement in terms of operational capabilities. A very good chunk of Hamas's rocket production industry, which is dotted across the Gaza Strip, was destroyed, and Hamas is going to require a long time to rebuild the ability to make rockets. Many dozens of rocket launchers were destroyed, but Hamas had so many of these scattered throughout Gaza that the IDF didn't know where all of them were, and that's why it was able to continue firing. So that's why we saw rocket fire right up until the last day. And of course, the personnel of Hamas were killed in large numbers. Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, over 200 killed, according to the IDF's assessments, ranging from on-the-ground rocket launching cells and anti-tank missile firing cells, all the way up to senior commanders and members of the general staff of Hamas. These are senior brigade commanders, people involved in research and development and Hamas's military industries. So a large cross-section of Hamas's personnel were eliminated during this conflict.
Thank you very much for that overview. So as our initial plan for this conversation was set a few weeks ago, and we were going to focus on Iran in particular, obviously the events of the last few weeks changed our initial focus. But as is so often the case in the Middle East, when there's trouble, Iran's behind it. So if you could share with us what the particular Iranian connection is to the current crisis, we'd all be very grateful.
So approximately 90% of the know-how, according to IDF assessments, of the ability to produce rockets and other kinds of weapons in Gaza comes from Iran, whether it's Hamas's engineers who traveled to Iran and brought back their know-how to set up these factories, or whether it was smuggling, which Iran was able to do more freely until recent years. It's still able to do that, but it's struggling to do that in terms of the quantities when we compare that to past years of things like grad rockets and anti-tank missiles. So whether it's domestic production or smuggling, Iran is behind the forced buildup process in the Gaza Strip of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And if you add to that the funding that these organizations receive from Gaza, it's clear that Gaza is just one part of this sort of deep Iranian crescent that the Islamic Republic is trying to build around the state of Israel. And in their vision, and this was something that was pioneered by Qasem Soleimani, the late commander of the Quds Force, who was assassinated in a US drone strike last year, the idea is really to surround Israel with this chokehold of attack bases, rocket and missile bases from Lebanon, from Syria, and it's important to point out that Iran's Syria project is being disrupted constantly by Israeli preventative action. Iraq, even the Houthis in Yemen might play a role, and the Gaza Strip, and they hope to penetrate the West Bank too. So the idea is to surround Israel with this level of firepower to challenge its viability as a secure state. And the Gaza Strip plays a key role in that Iranian vision. This is how Iran destabilizes the region. Israel is not the only country facing this predicament and this threat in the region. There are others, primarily Saudi Arabia. But in the Israeli case, it's the most acute and it's the most focused Iranian effort. So it's impossible to view Gaza in isolation. We have to understand that this force buildup, these intentions, this Islamist regime that is ruling the Gaza Strip is partly there because Iran nourishes it with concepts, with technology, with weapons, with funds, with expertise. So this is absolutely linked to Iran's overall regional activities.
So thank you for that overview. And before we get into too much detail on Lebanon and Syria in general, I'm interested in your view of the few rockets that were fired from Lebanon during the current crisis. I know as an American Jew who cares deeply about these things, when those initial reports were coming out about rockets firing from Lebanon, it was enormously concerning because by anyone's account, the capacities of Hezbollah are much more significant than even those of Hamas in Gaza. The reporting since, as I understand it, was that those rockets were not launched by Hezbollah, they were launched by other groups. But if you could shed some light on whether it be the types of groups that were firing those rockets, why they were fired, the way Israelis view that kind of threat, and also perhaps the way that Hezbollah assessed the situation in the last few weeks as well. It would be very interesting to hear your perspective on it.
Sure. Well, we had a couple of incidents of rocket fire from Lebanon, and the general assessment is that the direct perpetrators of those attacks are Palestinian organizations based in southern Lebanon using fairly rudimentary rocket launchers, perhaps Grad launchers, with a range of about 40 kilometers, and firing from southern Lebanon from a sort of mobile launcher that you can set up and take apart pretty quickly. The big question is, did Hezbollah give its consent to this activity? And that's an important question. It does not have a clear answer. There are divided opinions. It's a subject of a debate. There are those who think that Hezbollah absolutely did give its consent for this to happen, based on its desire to signal to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad that they're not alone. But if it does this through these Palestinian organizations, it reduces the risk to itself. And of course, there are others who think that Hezbollah doesn't have hermetic control over everything that happens in southern Lebanon, and it couldn't really stop these attacks if they were determined to go ahead. And Hezbollah is very busy in Lebanon dealing with a host of severe domestic issues, an economic collapse, socioeconomic troubles, and major political paralysis. And Lebanon, is on the verge of collapse, on the verge of being a failed state. It's a bankrupt, it can't repay its loans. So Hezbollah has its plate full. Now, what helps us answer this question, perhaps, is what happened in Syria during the escalation, because Syria also was not quiet. There was initially a rocket attack from southern Syria, and that was followed by a drone attack. An armed drone took off from Syria and flew over parts of Jordan before entering Israel from Jordanian airspace. Now, if you put together all of these incidents, and by the way, the Syrian attacks very likely came from radical Shiite elements that are directly backed by the Iranian Quds Force. It does appear like Iran wanted to send a signal of solidarity with Gaza and a threatening message to Israel that, yes, we're going to surround you from every direction, and this is the plan. And it's really an attempt by the Iranian Axis, you could make the argument, to signal its presence and push back, against this wave of normalizations that we just had between Israel and the Sunni states, and the whole sort of mood that was dominant in the region, that Sunni Arab countries, pragmatic countries in Israel can normalize their relations despite a lack of a resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a real sort of a changing wind. And I think the Iranian axis was very threatened by that. It undermines its message directly. And as a result of that, I think that they saw an opportunity to exploit the Gazan escalation to send that signal that this axis is here, it's dominant, and it's not about to let the region normalize relations with Israel.
Very interesting indeed. So we're going to get to the JCPOA momentarily, but before we do, on the note related to the JCPOA, negotiations are currently ongoing in Vienna between the Biden administration, between the Iranian representatives and other countries that are involved as well, over a potential re-entry by both the US and Iran, either into the JCPOA or into some other deal. But again, before we get into those particular negotiations and mostly the Israeli concerns about the JCPOA, I'd like to ask you, what's your view between the linkage of the fact that those negotiations are going on with Iran right now, and yet the Iranian-supported groups, primarily in Gaza, but as we discussed it in the periphery of Israel as well, took a number of simultaneous actions against an American ally at the same point. Can you offer your assessment on the way that you think the Iranians view that dichotomy?
Absolutely. I think that that's a great question, because what we're seeing now is really a glimpse into the future if Iran gets its way. And I don't think it's possible to view the Iranian nuclear program in isolation. When we look at the Iranian threat, it's vital to take a comprehensive overall view. So it's the nuclear program, it's Iran's regional activity, it's the proxies, it's the weapons that Iran funnels to its proxies, and the weapons that it researches and develops on Iranian soil. And it's sort of this 360-degree view of the Iranian threat that really helps us understand how Iran views the JCPOA. The fact that it looks, at least as of now, that Iran and world powers are edging towards a re-engagement of the 2015 deal without any major changes that are visible at this point is extremely disturbing, not only to Israel, but also to those Sunni countries that are threatened by Iran's intentions for the region. Because that agreement will not only make huge amounts of money available to the Iranian regime, we're talking about $90 billion in frozen Iranian accounts. It will also enable them to export oil and gain, tens of billions of dollars in earnings from that. And it will basically flood the Iranian economy with new money, and a portion of that money will, of course, go to funding Iran's regional radical destabilization program, which we've just outlined, nourishing its proxies, arming its proxies, quote unquote, exporting the revolution. It's all under that banner. If we add to that fact the fear that's, as I say, in Jerusalem, but not only in Jerusalem, that the agreement that's on the table now will allow Iran to become a nuclear threshold state within a decade or so, roughly by 2030, because of those sunset clauses, which begin expiring in just a few years. So when you throw all of that together, that creates a disturbing image and scenario for this region. And it's one that not only Israel, but also its pragmatic Sunni partners have to develop a counter strategy for as we speak.
Thank you for that. So on that note, and you've referenced it, whether it be Israel's new Sunni partners, also the various sorts of destabilizing activities we saw, whether it be Iran's increased role in Syria or Yemen or a number of other countries throughout the region after the JCPOA was previously entered into. Within Israel, what is the view there of what's changed since 2015? And what lessons should be learned from the way that Iran responded to the deal then, that Israelis want the world to hear now about concerns about a re-entry into the agreement?
So maybe the first thing to note is that when the 2015 deal was struck, there was a real division inside Israel over whether the net assessment of that deal is positive or negative. And it's important to draw attention to that argument, because there are those who say that Israel rejects any attempt, to reach an agreement with Iran over its nuclear program. And it's really not the case, because there were certainly people in Israel, people who were senior in the defense establishment, who said when the 2015 deal was struck, that this is a bad deal. There's no argument about that, but it still buys Israel a window of opportunity, of approximately 15 years until those sunset clauses go away, that Israel can use to improve its strategic situation and prosper and build up its military for future challenges. And there was an argument over whether those 15 years were worth it, or whether it was an advantage or disadvantage. So there was not a single Israeli voice on the 2015 deal, and that has to be said. Prime Minister Netanyahu was extremely vocal about rejecting that deal. There were others who took a different view. I don't see that as being the case today. Today, it seems to me, we had a speech by the former IDF, by the current IDF Chief of Staff, Aviv Kochavi, who said in the most clear manner that any deal that's struck today that resembles the 2015 deal is going to be a very negative development for the region. And this is a military chief who's weighing in a very public way. He did this during a speech about the deal. And this represents a consensus view within the general staff, within the IDF, that going back to the same deal today, in the current time that we are in, is basically a roadmap to leading Iran to becoming a nuclear threshold state, and to do that with full international legitimacy. Because those sunset clauses haven't been changed, they haven't been extended as of now, everything has to be qualified. The view in Israel, and it's far more of a consensus today than it was in 2015, is that a copy paste of the 2015 deal is unacceptable, dangerous, and is likely to lead to conflict, to be frank. So that's a view that I'm gathering from here.
So what I'm hearing from you is the sort of number one concern between what's changed is that it's not 2015 anymore. So these sunsets that may have been, when they were, X amount of years ago, now they're immediately coming up in the near term. So to that point, is it your view that, if the U.S. and the other parties were to re-enter, a full agreement with Iran, the primary concern would be adjusting these sunset dates, and or are there other issues that Israel would also want to see addressed in future negotiations?
I think that Israel would, in terms of the other issues, those being what we've discussed, Iran's destabilizing activities in the region, I don't think there's any realistic hope of injecting those into a new deal, because it's clear that the Iranians would never accept that. So if we're being, realistic, the Israeli hope is that those sunset clauses are significantly extended, and some of them removed completely. Sunset clauses on how much uranium the Iranians can enrich, and the level to which they can enrich it, and the centrifuges that they're able to research and develop. If those become a free-for-all, so to speak, by 2030, then Iran becomes a nuclear threshold state. I mean, there's no question about it. And as long as that's the case, there's not going to be an Israeli view of this deal that's positive in any way. So that's one thing. In terms of Iran's regional activities, I think what some in Israel hope for is a separate side deal between Israel and the United States, and the Sunni countries being partners of this deal as well, an understanding that red lines have to be drawn for Iran's regional activities, its weapons trafficking, its encouragement of attacks on sovereign countries, on airports in Saudi Arabia, on Israeli civilians in Israel from Gaza, and the force that it's building in Lebanon, its attempts to entrench itself in Syria, its attempts to take over Iraq, that there have to be red lines that are set with American approval and coordination, and that a regional coalition starts to push back on these activities with American approval. Now, we also have to take into account the fact that the United States is interested in leaving the region. We have to take stock of that, and we can't ignore it. The United States has decided to pivot towards facing China. That's the direction that the American defense establishment wants to go in. And that doesn't mean that the United States stops being a very important player in this region, but it does mean that it's going to likely have a reduced military presence. We're seeing, the exit from Afghanistan. We could see the same in Iraq. And again, this doesn't mean that the U.S. is simply leaving the region, but it does mean that there will be more to do for the U.S. as allies in the region, for them to do directly by themselves, Israel and the Sunni countries. And the United States, in my view, it's very important for the United States to reach an agreement with its allies over what is unacceptable for the Iranians to do, and to provide all of the support that it can for Israel and the Sunni countries to push back on those activities.
So that comes to my next question, which is what does a changed region mean for the deal now? In 2015, Israel and a number of Sunni states surely had under the table relationships. Now those things have come to the fore. And to the point that you raised, my view as an American has always been that, these are sophisticated countries in their own right. Whatever America is going to do to directly engage in the region, they're looking out for their own interests. And the primary thing that, again, in my view, brought these countries together was a threat from Iran more than anything that the US could do directly. So you've discussed whether it be trying to form a unified front in the region with these newfound partners. Those countries all have sort of their similar border concerns, whether it be the Saudis in Yemen, a country like Morocco, where Iran has founded separatist movements. Is it your view that they similarly see the sunsets as the chief issue and really the only thing that can be achieved realistically, perhaps, in these deals? Or, are they in somewhat of a divergence with Israel over what needs to happen with these sorts of negotiations?
I think if we're looking at their sort of, behind closed doors position, I don't think there's any daylight between the Israeli view of the Iranian nuclear program and the Saudi view of the Iranian nuclear program and the view from the UAE or Bahrain. They're all facing the threat of Iranian proxies who by the end of the decade could be operating under some sort of nuclear umbrella, even if it's not an explicit one, that Iran extends over them as it encourages them to attack and destabilize every country that it sees standing in its way of creating this access and this crescent. In terms of public positions, well, my concern is that if the perception in the region is that the United States has given up on trying to do anything more than reach a sort of short-term nuclear agreement that quote unquote puts Iran in a box, for 5 to 10 years, but after that it, emerges from the box with all of the components that the region does not want it to have, the extra cash, the confidence, and the regional proxy network, I think that if that becomes the case, we will see more and more Gulf countries reaching out to Iran out of a position of distress and seeking some sort of diplomatic connection with them in order to try and negotiate an accommodation with the Iranian regime. And that's simply based on a real politics sort of recognition that, okay, the Iranian regime is about to get a lot stronger, it's about to get richer, it's about to get more powerful. So we better figure out a way to get them to stop threatening us as much as they are. And if that happens, I think that would be an early signal of where the winds might be turning. It's something that I think it's very important to try and avoid. But again, if we see those sort of feelers coming out of Gulf countries to Iran, that's an early sign that they're assessing, even though they would never want this deal to go ahead, they see it as a sort of lost cause, and the cascading effects that we just discussed, they also see that as being inevitable, and they're trying to basically minimize their damage.
So going back actually to what we discussed before and what happened over the last couple of weeks in Israel and between Israel and Hamas, as it relates to the various Sunni states that have come into normalization agreements with Israel, do you view that there's been any fracturing over what's happened in Israel? Do you think the Iranians saw an opportunity to potentially fracture some of those relationships through their support of Hamas over the last 2 weeks? Or is it the fact that these various Sunni states recognize that the Iranian nuclear threat is so severe that they have to, put aside any issue over, violence in Gaza, with regard to what's going to come forward with the Iranian nuclear program?
So I think the leadership of these Sunni states, nothing has changed from their calculation and their considerations into what drove them into the Abraham Accords to begin with. But in terms of their positioning, it's become more difficult. They're facing increased public pressure. The images coming out of the Gaza Strip are what they are, and and Israel's adversaries are able to use those images in the region to pressure those Sunni governments and to say, this is who you've signed an agreement with, and that's very much serves the agenda of the radicals in this region, of Hamas, of Iran, and the various Islamists that are in action here. So it makes their life harder, is the bottom line. It does not change their consideration. They knew very well what the situation was when they signed the agreement, and they reached the conclusion that Israel is a major strategic asset for them to be cooperating with for a host of reasons. And I don't think that has changed anything, but in terms of their ability to justify this decision regionally, it becomes harder for them to do so. And that's really part of this Iranian, I think, challenge, the Iranian access and radical access challenge to this movement of modernization.
Thank you for that. So shifting to another relevant area as it relates to the issue of potential of a nuclear Iran, can you discuss a little bit about what's happening in Iran, whether it be the fact that the Iranians have their own political issues in their country with elections on the horizon, and we'll get to it a little bit later, but their apparent counterintelligence operations that have occurred in Iran with sabotage and things like that over the last, I guess I would say, year or so at various Iranian facilities as well.
Yeah, well, if we begin with those reported sabotage incidents, what they tell us, if we look at the assessed damage that occurred at Natanz last summer during the attack on that facility, which is Iran's main uranium enrichment facility, with Fordow being a secondary site at the moment. What they show us is that so far the only thing that has really put a dent in Iran's nuclear program is either acts of sabotage or the threat to use force. It's true that the 2015 nuclear agreement put a temporary lid on Iran's progress, but it didn't do anything to Iran's infrastructure. The infrastructure was frozen, it wasn't dismantled. That's one of the key problems that many in Israel had with the deal. But the latest reported sabotage attack took out approximately 5,000 centrifuges at Natanz, according to some reports. And that's a major blow to Iranian enrichment capabilities. And I think that's an important lesson going forward as to what actually, de facto pushes back on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. Iran itself is, of course, a complex country, and it has its own divisions. And we know that there are camps in Iran that are fighting for power, that are struggling for power. We've had the reformists fighting the conservative movement, and of course, the supreme leader Khamenei is more sympathetic ideologically to the hardliners in Iran, but he's also agreed with the reformists on key decisions like going into the 2015 deal, which is something that the hardliners were against, and the reformists convinced him to do that to basically rescue the Iranian economy. So the Iranians are about to have elections in June, and it's unclear whether that's going to affect the timing of the current talks. Iran may choose to wait until the elections are over before it finalizes the new nuclear agreement, the new old nuclear agreement, we can say. But it seems clear that whatever the outcome of those elections are, and most are predicting a victory for a hardline candidate, that Iran will take the opportunity to re-enter the nuclear agreement with the world powers, because the gains are far higher than the losses. And the Iranians have been able to prove, the reformists have been able to prove that the amount of legitimacy and money and capabilities that Iran gains from these types of agreements are more beneficial to the regime's viability and stability than going it alone and not reaching any agreements with the international community. So, despite the dynamic situation in Iran, I would say that it probably won't affect the overall Iranian decision to go for the agreement in the coming months.
So on that note, I mean, these things are obviously very difficult to predict, but you brought up a very interesting point that the supreme leader previously agreed with the reformists to go into the deal, and through that learned that there was significant benefits to accrue for regime stability. Is it your view that is still consistent with the thinking at this point within the leadership of Iran? Or are there reasons to think, as some do from what I understand, that they actually don't necessarily want to re-enter a deal? What's your assessment on what their motivations are here?
So I think that, when somebody like the supreme leader and the Iranian National Security Council, when they look at the net assessment of entering versus not entering a deal, they're going to struggle to justify to themselves not entering a deal that has short-term sunset clauses, as we've discussed, floods the Iranian economy with tens of billions of dollars very quickly, and then further money from oil exports, and lifts the lid on the global financial network that Iran is currently banned from taking part on, and a whole host of other restrictions and sanctions that the Trump administration slapped on Iran when it employed its maximum pressure campaign from 2018 onwards. And these were designed to actually prevent the Biden administration from reaching a new deal too easily, quote unquote. Those would also be lifted by the Biden administration. So I think, for all of the bravado of the hardliners about the resilience economy, these are things that the Iranians have proven that they're able to do. They're able to build an economy that does not collapse under very severe binding international sanctions. The temptation to rejoin the global economy and to export freely and to have access to global banking and finances, I think it will be too great for any Iranian leadership to ignore. So I would be very surprised if they turn down that opportunity.
That's a very interesting assessment, and helpful for us in America to view this for the way that experts like you in the region see it. On a similarly interesting note, something we discussed last week was the state of the Iranian economy. I have seen reports of very low cash reserves and the suggestion that The Iranians immediately need this infusion of economic relief and sanctions relief, or they're facing, potential collapse. In our discussion, what you noted is that may be the case, but there are reasons to think that it's not actually the case, and that the Iranians have been quite effective at still engaging in certain economic activity despite the sanctions the country is currently under. Can you offer your assessment on how vulnerable the Iranian economy is, and what kind of leverage that gives the U.S. in negotiations?
Sure. I think it's actually one of those issues where the right thing to do is to put a question mark as the answer and not an exclamation mark, because as you've said very accurately, there are two competing views about the state of the Iranian economy. Some people say, look at their inflation level, look at their unemployment level, look at their stunted exports, their oil exports. This is an economy that's on the brink of collapse. And there are other experts on the Iranian economy who say, well, it's not quite so simple. Their GDP recovery in the second half of last year was actually much better, or significantly better than what some had predicted. They have found ways to export oil illegally. They have whole access to black markets throughout the region, in Iraq, and they've also been exporting oil to other places like Syria. And it seems like they're able to survive these sanctions. So I'm going to be honest and say that for me, this is a question mark. It's not clear to me what the real state of the Iranian economy is. But I will say that there have been many predictions that they're on the brink of collapse, and none of those predictions have come true so far. And I think that we have to be wary of overconfident predictions about how soon the Iranians are to economic collapse. We've just heard a lot of those. And the Iranian, the IRGC has a very large control of the Iranian economy itself. So it's able to, carry out many damage control activities, I think, many of which go under the international radar in order to help the regime survive economically. So it's extremely complex, and it's extremely difficult to judge, unfortunately.
So thank you for the honest assessment of that. And I'll just note, from someone looking from the outside, in the lead up to the prior JCPOA, there was a significantly longer period of sanctions that were on Iran, whereas now we're really only talking about a couple of years. Now, of course, there's been a global economic crisis unlike perhaps anything we've ever seen through coronavirus that could escalate that sort of stress. But it does very much make sense to me, as you suggest, that there's a lot we don't know about Iran's actual economic position. So it's hard to assess on the leverage question.
Yep.
My next question similarly relates to the economy, but on sanctions relief. So whether or not there's a new deal that's entered into, if there's a deal entered into, and as you suggest, that is the most likely outcome, Iran will receive significant sanctions relief. Is it your assessment, and is it the assessment of other people in Israel, that the sanctions relief will be used similarly as the countries going into Syria to prop up Bashar al-Assad? So it's not clear, again, that there's a regime on the brink of collapse that they want to prop up. But is it the same countries, whether it be Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, again, I mentioned Morocco briefly before as well, and there are others that you think the Iranians will focus on in their foreign policy with sanctions relief? Or are there other countries that observers in the West should be taking notice of, might similarly be vulnerable to Iranian intrusion into their affairs?
Right. So the assumption behind the question, I think, is 100% accurate. The Iranians will use a good chunk of that money to fund their regional destabilization activities and their crescent that they're trying to entrench throughout the entire region. Foreign and regional policies, they don't need to look any further than the leaked recordings of the foreign minister of Zarif, who, for an extended amount of time during this recording, was complaining over the fact that he has no say whatsoever about Iran's foreign and regional policies. It's the Quds Force, it's the IRGC, These are the components in Iran, the power brokers who decide what Iran does with its assets and with its resources in the region. I think we can expect Iran to double down on the entrenchment program. It's going to double down, in my view, on its attempts to turn Syria into a zone of influence, and that means an attempt to recreate the Hezbollah model in Syria, an array of Shiite militias that will be armed with a host of surface-to-surface projectiles, an attempt to turn as many of those projectiles into precision-guided munitions as possible, which is its own a separate issue that's very problematic for Israeli security. And an attempt to do the same in Iraq. In Iraq, the situation is more complicated and more difficult in some sense for Iran to operate in, but it still has access to tens of thousands of loyalist Shiite militia members that it can arm, train, equip, and use as an additional front in the future. So I think, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, of course, the Houthis in Yemen, who have proven to be, from Iran's perspective, a very successful agent for attacking its rival in Saudi Arabia and for promoting this concept of an Iranian crescent. And certainly, funding terrorist cells inside Gulf states, in places like Bahrain, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, and overseas. Of course, there's an extensive overseas Shiite terror network. I believe that all of these activities will go up a gear in a post-nuclear deal reality, and they will pose new challenges for the region. And I think that, the Iranian defense industry is another thing that has to be highlighted here. Iran produces a large number of well-trained engineers, scientists, mathematicians, people who are important for developing missiles and drones and precision-guided weaponry and miniaturizing technology and figuring out how to plant these kinds of weapons in urban centers, all of the things that we're seeing the Iranian proxies do. The Iranian defense industry is now, it's developing satellite launch vehicles, which can double up as long-range missiles in the future. This is an industry that's going places, unfortunately, and it's heavily invested in. So I would expect that investment to only go up in that kind of reality. And then we have to keep in mind that whatever is developed and produced in Iran ends up in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Syria, and in some form or another in Gaza. So that is unfortunately the reality of an Iran that's going to be far wealthier than it is today.
Can you briefly on that note discuss Iran's foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere? I think less people are familiar with this, but there have been a number of reports about Hezbollah's involvements with drug cartels in the Western Hemisphere, Hezbollah's investment in Venezuela, and certain other countries. Can you assess the state of those operations and potentially the interest of the Iranian government in pursuing a foreign policy in the Western Hemisphere, should they have the resources to do so?
Yeah, by the way, regarding drugs, there are also reports of Hezbollah drug exports throughout the region here, including to Jordan, to Israel, to Saudi Arabia. There have been multiple reports of Hezbollah making a side living, if we can describe it that way, on top of its, approximate $700-800 million that it receives from Iran as an annual budget. It looks to complement that income through the sales of narcotics. It has tapped into worldwide narcotics networks, some in South America, some in Central America. There have been multiple reports of Hezbollah operatives working hand in hand with drug cartels. It's a very lucrative industry, and Hezbollah has made some money from it. And as I said, they've also been doing the same right here in this region, exporting a variety of drugs, including synthetic drugs, to the entire region, and embarrassing Lebanon greatly as a result, because there have been discoveries recently of crates of fruit that came from Lebanon. I believe they were found in Saudi Arabia to be packed with synthetic drugs. And there was a decision to ban fruit imports from Lebanon. So sure, Hezbollah is looking to make as much money as it can. And the issue of narcotics is certainly one area where it can supplement its income in that manner, both regionally and in the Western Hemisphere. To a certain degree, it's not a main area of activity for Hezbollah, but it's certainly a area of activity.
Thank you for that. So shifting gears as we turn towards the close of our conversation to Iranian's nuclear program itself. So whether it be through deficiencies in an agreement with Iran, or whether it be that Iran, sort of under the radar is able to produce a nuclear weapon, what are the concerns within Israel about what Iran is likely to use a nuclear weapon for? Of course, the gravest concern would be an actual offensive attack, but short of that, what does that mean for the various proxy organizations that they support in the region, and whether it be the US's capacity, Israel's capacity, or other states' capacities to deal with these proxy forces?
Right. So you alluded to the worst case scenario of an Iranian nuclear strike, which we can assume that that's unlikely, and yet still reach the conclusion that Iran must never have a nuclear weapon. The only way that I can envisage a first nuclear strike by Iran is if there is some sort of instability within the Iranian regime and a faction of the regime seizes power that's not currently in power, and it would go so far as to do that and endanger the survivability of Iran as a state as a result. Short of that, I think that it's fair to assume that Iran wants a nuclear weapon because, when it looks over at North Korea and it sees, that regime able to basically have immunity from attack because it is a nuclear armed state, that is the kind of security that they want to achieve for themselves. They don't ever again want to be threatened by a future Saddam Hussein, by a future America. And certainly, even though they're the ones who are drawing Israel's defensive activities, they also want to be able to make sure that they're safe from a major Israeli attack. So they view nuclear weapons as a survivability, long-term immunity strategy for that regime. And I don't think, however, it's possible to separate that from the offensive momentum that a nuclear weapon would grant to the Iranian access. Because even if Iran becomes a threshold nuclear state, or even worse, if it has a proven nuclear capability, it's conducted a nuclear test, the emboldenment that would cause to Iran and its proxies would likely make them more reckless and aggressive significantly than they are today. If we want to look at this in a sort of microcosm, Hamas became more confident the more rockets it amassed. And these are extremely conventional, surface-to-surface rockets. Yet the more it had, the more confident it became of its ability to intimidate Israel, to terrorize Israel, to take risks that it wouldn't do. And I think that mentality would work exactly the same way with an Iranian regime that has nuclear weapons. It would embolden it, and it would cause it to take risks either directly or through its proxies that it wouldn't do today. And on top of all of that, I think that it's inevitable that if Iran becomes nuclear, the Sunni states that Iran threatens would start looking at how to turn civilian nuclear programs into military nuclear programs. They would start to look at how they could be armed with nuclear weapons themselves. I wouldn't, be surprised at all if the Saudis, the Egyptians, perhaps even the Turks, all of them said, well, we should have nuclear weapons too. We can't let, only Iran have it. And then you would have a situation where, the region's most unstable arena becomes flooded with nuclear weapons. And I don't think you need to be a, strategic expert to understand how negative a consequence that would be. So that's the kind of reality that we're looking at. And that is why Israel is committed to ensuring that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon, whatever the cost is.
So on that final note about proliferation and stability in the region, I actually think that's something that's very under discussed, whether it be in reporting about this concern of proliferation. Most people say, this country is bad and therefore they shouldn't have a nuclear weapon. But they often, in my view, fail to appreciate the future risks of what may be of who's ruling that territory in the future. So for example, the most prominent one would be that Israel bombed a Syrian, or purportedly bombed a Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007.
Yep.
And that territory during the Syrian civil war was actually taken over by ISIS. So what do you think the level of concern is around this issue about, you think about 20 years from now, do you actually know who's going to be governing this territory? Do you think that's something that's fully appreciated in the region, or is it a little bit undervalued in your view?
I think it should be fully appreciated by everybody. I mean, we can look at past examples, look at Egypt today, which is ruled, in my view, by a government that's very pragmatic in terms of its regional security considerations and its activities, very understanding of Israel's security problems. Well, that wasn't always the case, right? I mean, in 2012, Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood took over Egypt. And Egypt back then, just as now, was armed with F-16s and M1 Abrams tanks. And this army was now technically under the command of the Muslim Brotherhood, who are directly linked to Hamas in Gaza. So when Morsi was overthrown a year later, there was a large sigh of relief in Jerusalem. And this is the region that we're in. We're in a region that is not stable, unfortunately, and where a friend today may not remain a friend tomorrow, not because his perception has changed, but because he is no longer in power. And as long as that's the case, we have to be very mindful of when we're talking about military capabilities, conventional or unconventional, that those who possess those capabilities today may not be the same people in charge tomorrow. And that goes for most states in this region. And it's a vital consideration. And I think that it's one that cannot be ignored by anybody who wants to understand the long-term strategic considerations of this region.
So as we turn to my final question, it again deals with the nuclear issue in Iran. And I'd like to know your assessment of the strike capacity in Iran, whether it be of the United States, whether it be of Israel, whether it be of other allies in the region, should, again, whether it be through a flawed agreement or through some other mechanism that Iranian breakout actually occurs or is so near to occurring that there's a need for an offensive strike. What's your assessment of, again, U.S., Israeli, or other capacities in the region?
Well, I can discuss certainly some Israeli capabilities, long-range capabilities. I would just say that before I do, I think it's very much the hope of people here in Israel that governments find a way to dissuade Iran from taking that threshold crossing step through other means. It's certainly the hope that this attack can be avoided by making clear to Iran what the consequences would be. That even if it reaches a position where it can develop nuclear weapons, it still would choose not to through deterrence. I think it's important to put that out there. That's not a strategy that we should give up on so fast.
Of course.
Having said that, Israel has certainly placed back at the top of its priority its ability to strike in Iran if necessary. There have been public statements to that end. The Israeli Air Force, the Israeli intelligence community, they're all planning these options. And of course, again, it has to be stressed, planning an option does not mean that any decision has been made to activate them. They certainly want these options back on the table. And a lot of money is going into this. It's obviously highly classified, and getting into the details of it is extremely difficult. But Israel has, mid-air refuelers. It has fighter jets that can reach Iran, that can strike. It has standoff weaponry. It has electronic warfare. It has all of the capabilities that it needs to build and then keep improving an attack option. And certainly making that option relevant to today's challenges in the region has come back to the very top of the priority list for the Israeli defense establishment, just to make sure that option is there if needed. And it should also be noted that it's very likely that an attack in Iran would immediately trigger a regional conflict with Hezbollah as well. So it's very difficult to view an attack as an isolated event. It could create a sort of northern theater, Hezbollah, the proxies that Iran has in Syria and Iraq. And this is also a scenario that the IDF is preparing heavily for this multi-front conflict with a real emphasis on the northern theater of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, responding to a strike on Iran's nuclear program. So the planning is taking place, the investment is taking place, and the capabilities are being put into place as we speak, with the hope that they will not need to be used.
Thank you, Yaakov. And of course, we all agree that's the case. And no one wants any sort of offensive need for anything. And our hope is that all can be avoided. I'll give you the last word if you want it, but I'll just say from my perch here in America, I always appreciate reading your analysis. I always appreciate MirYam because of the opportunity to elevate experts such as yourself, who are on the ground in the region and can offer a type of expertise that, whether it's someone sitting in New York, sitting in Washington, is just always naturally going to be lacking on a number of these issues. So I thank you for the time you spent with me today. I thank MirYam for putting this platform together. And again, like I said, if you want a last word, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. I really enjoyed speaking to you. I think I would like a last word and maybe to send a message of hope as well, that there are enough pragmatic and moderate elements in this region that Israel can work with in order to create a better future. And I think that there's an opportunity now to push back against the radicals, against the Islamists, against the state and non-state actors in this region. And I think it can be done, and I think the time has come for Israel to do that proactively, and not only to rely on its military capabilities for self-defense, but to start, putting together a coalition that will act as a force multiplier, and to make it clear to this region that the pragmatic and moderate and non-extremist forces in this region are not going to let the Islamists and the radicals set the agenda for the region, and I believe that can be done with the right strategy going ahead.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I do appreciate you leaving us on a little bit of a positive note. And I agree with you. There are reasons to be optimistic. And it's certainly all of our hopes here in America that that proves to be true.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.